Okay, introduce yourself and your job.
Yeah, my name is Lindsay Delaney. I'm a freelance librarian. Right now, I'm providing story time for a nearby suburban library. But most recently, up until February 2022, I was a bilingual children's librarian at a suburban library, providing services to kids, teens, and their families in Spanish.
Oh, wow. So what is your experience with collection development?
Yeah, so for about 4.5 years, I managed children's collections. That whole time, I had the kids and teens Spanish collection, and then some of my other collections have bounced around. So I've experienced developing early readers,
Mhm.
kids nonfiction, biographies, CDs, and then I also had the opportunity to help launch the Kids Library of Things collection.
Oh, wow. What was that like?
It was so much fun because we were really building it from scratch. So I'd seen Library of Things get built up at nearby libraries. When I was in graduate school at the University of Michigan, I worked at the Ann Arbor District Library,
Mhm.
and they have what they call their tools collection. So I'd seen a few different approaches and had some time to think about it before we got started. Um, and it was really about kind of like honing like what our priorities are going to be, because when you get to things like like it feels like it could be anything in the world beside books. And so trying to figure out how to narrow that down, I ended up really focusing on things that would circulate well, in the sense like they'd stand up to circulation, but then would they serve like a priority, like um, for, providing representation or linguistic access, or maybe they really fit in with a set of programming materials that the
Mhm.
county could provide to our library. So someday in the future, when we'd be doing programming again, maybe kids would get to work with an Ozobot in our program and then check one out. So trying to balance different factors and find things that I thought would be really exciting. Sometimes I felt like I was channeling my inner children's museum or science museum as I was picking things out, or just also toys or games that would be really fun.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. I don't think I've ever met anybody who's done collection development with Library of Things.
Hmm.
It sounds like a fun area to be in.
Oh, absolutely. I loved it.
So, how or where did you learn about collection development, your skill set?
Yeah. I learned it in both practical settings and
Mhm.
in the classroom. So I took a collection development class with the University of Michigan for my master's, but I'd say the bulk of what I learned, especially because I was in public libraries and my
Mhm.
programming was serving, both academic and public. So it had to be like, at the 10,000-foot view, was really hands-on projects. So when I was an intern at the Beaverton City Library, they were able to help include me in like doing a small cart order for their Spanish
Oh.
collection at that time. When I was at the Ann Arbor District Library, they were reopening a new branch, so I got to help pick additional materials to round out their children's collection there. And then a lot of just like hands-on jumping in and learning from the people who held the collections before me about some strategies, and then just,
Mhm.
trying it out myself.
What kind of strategies did you use?
Yeah, I think it helps to remember that you're only doing like one part of collection at a time at
Right.
any moment. You don't have to do it all at once. So,
Mhm.
and every collection was a little bit different and required a different strategy. For like my book collections, like
Mhm.
kids nonfiction or Spanish, we would order the bulk of our materials through iPage, Ingram's iPage,
Mhm.
and so it was kind of figuring out both at the same time like what review resources and ways of finding new books that were coming were the most useful, and then also how to use the tools so that I'm not spending way too much time
Yeah.
doing it. And I'd say I ended up streamlining that over time. I found what reviews and like what things are most important. So let's say a monthly kids order by the end of my 4.5, 10 year in kids nonfiction might look like, hey, so I have a saved search that highlights kids nonfiction in the formats that I'm interested in, like, paperback, hardback.
Yeah.
That have received reviews. I'll skim through that and see what things have gotten reviews that I haven't looked at before, move those into a cart. I'll move things that maybe I'd saved and set aside because I knew I need a replacement item into that cart, and then kind of look at the total dollar value against what I had left that month.
Mhm.
So if I the total dollar value for the year divided by the number of months I had. So that's like one way that I would like keep it all manageable.
Yeah.
But then also knowing that like some of that selection was happening throughout the month. So I might be weeding the kids' animal books. Like, so I'm going book by book, and especially in kids' materials, it's really like, I found it was helpful. You really got to get your hands on every book as you're going through. If you just use a weeding list and just look by circle, like there's some gross stuff on the shelves. There's some things that have gone directly in the trash, not because they're metaphorically gross, but because like they're wet, you know, or something like that. So then as I would be going through, I would be setting things aside, because I was like, hey, as I'm weeding, I'm making different piles. I've got the things that I know I haven't circulated and are in poor shape. Those just go on the bottom cart. I'm not going to think about them again. They're just going to get straight to deprocessed. I'll have the section on my cart that's for things that I know are like out of date, but are do kind of circulating. So I'm going to put those in a different spot, because I'm going to check to see if I can get updated material. And then there's things that just haven't been circulating, but are otherwise in okay shape. I might put them in another spot, because I'll run them through and make sure that since my report ran, maybe, you know, they haven't circulated again, or maybe there's some other reason that I'll look at it and be like, you know, this hasn't really gone, but this has some sort of local appeal, or it's just not something that can be covered in our collection in any other way. And so like, I guess to bring it back to selection, like, so some of those decisions weeding along the way are then getting that work done to buying things, because it all goes together. I try to think about both what I'm getting rid of and what I'm buying at the same time.
Wow. It's I have a public library background, so I remember a lot of doing weeding of, especially like board books or books. They're really good.
Right, like you can see the corners been eaten. Just like it's just straight up gone. Yeah.
So those are easy weeds. What kind of training would you have liked to receive, or have you received, like on the job professional development?
Yeah, I ended up doing a class through Library Journal, I think. It was the county, because my library was part of a cooperative, was able to subscribe for as many people as wanted to attend. And so through that course, I learned about diversity audits and like some of like the diversity and inclusion things that we want to keep in mind with children's materials. And that was super helpful to get started on that process. So because of that class, I did a diversity audit of just the kids' chapter books in Spanish. And that got me thinking about like, what characteristics really do matter to me as I'm buying this collection for this collection? How can I think about representation? And just getting those questions in my mind did shift my practice. So what I ended up doing is, as I would be building my carts for Spanish, in the notes field of the cart, I would just jot down like, hey, what's interesting to me about this book? Is it because it was published by a publisher in Guatemala? Or, you know, does it feature a Black protagonist or something like that? Just like what's sticking out to me about that book and serving the goals I have for this collection to have better representation. And then when I have to make my final decision, because there's always more things than I can buy, you know, I can keep those in mind and keep those at the forefront, so it doesn't just get lost, you know, and that I'm still recreating the same kind of inequities in the collection. So that sort of training was super helpful. Also, we didn't even touch it in my graduate class, and I hope things like that shift. But I think seeking out those opportunities can be really valuable.
Yeah. And speaking of budget, how did you manage your budget? With the different areas?
So some of the collections, the amount was kind of set annually in conjunction with the reader services manager. So for like kids nonfiction, like that would just kind of be given to me at the start of the fiscal year, and I would know that I'd buy for 11 months of the year, because usually we wouldn't buy anything in June, which is the end of our fiscal year, just to make sure the books got to the building. So I'd roughly divide it by 11 and just kind of keep an eye on it as I went, knowing that actually it's kind of hard to, I found it kind of hard to overspend, because sometimes things would get canceled. You know, you're buying out in advance, especially over the pandemic year. It just like delivery and what publishers thought they could get out wouldn't. So yeah, roughly looking at it. And then our acquisitions would send us a report with how much has been spent and how much has sort of been allocated for things you haven't received, so you could keep an eye on it. Now for my Spanish collections, I'd get this chunk of money, but then within my Spanish collections were early readers, board books, picture books, fiction, graphic novels, nonfiction. So what I would do then is I would look at things like the total number of items in each of those little subgroups, the total circulation in each of those subgroups, kind of like the average circulation using those two numbers, and then also the average cost of a book of that type. And that's something I learned about from a community college speaker that came to my Michigan class, how they kind of used a formula to inform how much they should put into each of their subject areas based on like students and things like that. So I tweaked it to fit my needs. And then I didn't just take it as is, because those numbers, I mean, circulation is limited. It doesn't tell us about the impact things are having on the community, or it doesn't tell us everything about the goals for the collection. Like a really small collection might just kind of suffer under that when you know you're trying to grow it. But I would use that as kind of a starting place. And then I would adjust the numbers based on my experience. Like for nonfiction, for example, I always just moved a little bit more into that because I knew the collection was a little bit old and I wasn't including the age of the titles when I was doing that formula. And so I knew I wanted to be able to replace those animal books and get like good up-to-date information in Spanish to kids. So that was what I would do for that. And then just in Spanish, we ordered quarterly. So then each quarter I'd kind of look at the numbers and say, okay, this is how much I have left in each of those areas. And maybe I'll shift it around, or maybe I'll keep my estimate as it is, but it would keep me on track.
Yeah. So what about library things? How did you manage a budget with that?
Well, so the first time we did it, we just used, I think it was some gift money like that we could freely allocate. So we were told, I think we started with either $1,000 or $2,000. And then the packaging material came out of the technical services budget. What we did do as a group, though, is we sat down with kind of a group of stakeholders. So with people from technical services, people from circulation, people from adult services, as well as youth services, because we were starting both at the same time. And we're like, hey, what do we want in this collection? Like, what are we okay with? What are we not okay with? Because we wanted buy-in all around. And so, for example, circulation was like, please nothing with food. Like, I know other libraries do things with food, but just like don't. And we're like, you know what, that's fine. You know, we're not the ones who have to, you know, receive the item that just came back that still has like cake crumbs on it. I know other libraries are successful with it, but we were just starting. There's the whole world of items out there. We're like, yeah, we'll set that aside. We also talked about like the max value of an item we'd want. So we set the limit at around $100, I think, to start, because that was about the value of some of the e-readers that we circulated. And we also didn't want there to be a big burden on somebody if it got lost or damaged. So we didn't want it to be way too expensive. We also try to keep in mind like the number of pieces. I, especially for kids stuff, because there's so many things that have a lot of pieces, try to keep in mind, like, could this still circulate if something got lost? So, you know, like a jigsaw puzzle, if you lose a piece, is really not very satisfying anymore. But like a box of Legos, you know, if 10 go missing, whatever, not a big deal. Like, we'll just keep circulating it. So then within that budget, like I just started making my dream, like I just started going through the web. I read Wirecutter articles. I read school library journal articles of stuff people had. I dug through the catalog for some nearby libraries. I just went into my advanced search and I said, okay, what's in their library of things? And I scrolled through. I'd been to at least one talk already on library of things. So I knew like some things that libraries had that they like didn't suggest, like the 3D drawing pens that have a consumable. That was something we also agreed to the library, that we wouldn't circulate anything with a consumable component. And we bent that rule for like board games that have paper and pencil, because it's not a big deal. We can like put more paper and pencil in, but like the 3D drawing pens, they have to keep buying filament. We send no things. So I made that big list and I kind of tried to like label it with categories as I went. So I wanted to make sure I had a mix of music and games and science and early learning and literacy, and like robots and stuff, and just have a couple of examples of each to start. And I kept that process. We ended up I ended up preparing 3 orders in my time there. And by the end, I was also including some representation. So like we built up board games, they circulated really well. And then I also was like, you know what? A lot of board games are designed and like feature like a Eurocentric or white male perspective. So I really dug in to find some games that were designed by women, designed by Indigenous people that could work for families, even if they weren't explicitly advertised as kids. So like that went in a notes field, because I was doing that all in Excel, right? Like when I talked about my books, I was doing that in Ingram iPage, I was using their notes field. This time I could make it up myself. So I still use notes. I would, be like, okay, this might work for this, or this got a really good review, or this was recommended by a staff person or a member of the public. And then I would just keep thinking through the list. Okay, is this something I'd really want to circulate? Is this something I'd really want to deal with if something broke? Like how, is this filling in something we don't have yet? And just kind of keep iterating through the list. Maybe I spent more time on it than I would have, like if I'd kept doing that collection for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But because it was new, because it was new to our community, I really spent a lot of time looking at it and then leaving a little space. You said, because the question was how to manage the budget, but leaving a little bit of money unspent so that if something that was super popular broke, we'd be able to replace it and we wouldn't have to wait till that new fiscal year, because we were only ordering like once or twice a year for the big new stuff. And I feel like I had a thought fly through as I was saying that about something I kept in mind when I was ordering, but it's gone. So I'll bring it back up if it comes back.
It'll come back up. Yeah, I could talk to you just on like purchasing for library things. It sounds like you had so many questions that went through your head.
Yeah.
Especially with it being so new. That's fascinating. What advice would you give to someone just beginning collection development?
I would say that that in collection development, like one, we're going to lower the stakes. It's not brain surgery. You get rid of a book, like you're probably not working for the archive. You're probably not working for the university collection that is like the depository of all children's literature from the past decades. So you can't get rid of anything, especially if you're working in public libraries. Your role is to be like an enjoyable recreational collection, right? So just give yourself permission to get rid of stuff. Like there's nobody gonna double check your work. You're really not gonna get in trouble. And it took me a while to get that confidence there, but like you're hired for a reason. The community wants to have a like accessible, fun, up-to-date collection, and they don't want to make all the decisions you're making. You have been deputized to do, like you have been given that responsibility. And so get in there, get hands-on, get reading, because I think that's the best way to kind of know what you have. And eventually that mental model will build up. Like at the end of working with nonfiction, I really did have a good sense of like, what did the collection have? What areas were like suffering? And that like, and you won't have that right away, and it will feel kind of overwhelming. Just make the best decisions you can based on the reviews you have. And eventually you'll get some more knowledge to be like, hey, yeah, now I know as I'm reading reviews that every time I see a book that's about this or that or the other, I'm going to buy it because it's been really hard to find that. Another thing I'd have in mind is just like reviews aren't everything, especially in kids materials. Not everything gets reviewed. Like animal books, not every series animal books, or what I think of as kind of like the school publishers, gets a review. So you'll just kind of build up a sense of like what publishers are reputable, and you're just gonna have to buy stuff sometimes knowing like you're not gonna get someone else to read it first, but it might be good. And also the reason you don't want to put reviews on a pedestal is that sometimes that means that you wouldn't get the local stuff, you wouldn't get things from smaller publishers that have important representation. I think about like a kid's book about is based in Portland. They started out as a direct to consumer. They're kids books on important topics like mental health or faith or like even death. And they're kind of meant for that upper middle grade, but like read together with a parent or a trusted adult. But because they're kind of in that, like they didn't get reviewed right away, I learned about them from a parenting magazine that was local to the area. So just like be willing to be flexible with how you learn about materials. And if your gut says like something's missing in the collection, I'm not seeing any reviews about it, like go ahead and Google and say like, yeah, are there any new, like the tribal nations in my region, like do they self-publish anything? Like, can I add that, even though that's not going to get a review because it doesn't have that national appeal or the publisher's budget to like send review copies. So I guess all that to say, like, it's going to take some time to get your mind around the collection. So just jump in, know that you were hired for a reason to like learn as you go, and also learn that like you're going to get to make some of those decisions. You don't have to always depend on like other experts to tell you it's okay to add that book.
I think that's a great point to make. Reviews aren't the end all be all of literature or nonfiction too. I guess my final question would just be, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to share? Anything from your experience about collection development and management?
Yeah, I would encourage, I think the thing that's most exciting to me and where I think I want to continue putting more effort in my career someday is just like really continuing to think about merchandising and like shelf locations and how we do things. I mentioned like I work for a recreational correction, and my kids nonfiction use the Dewey Decimal System, which is just like problematic and dated and tricky in a lot of ways. And so as you do that collection, as you're selecting and deselecting, also kind of thinking about how can you make your collections browsable and accessible to kids. I think when I've seen picture book collections that are like fully genreified, which is a huge, or put into topics or and that's a huge effort. But I've also seen a library that just added like 5 sections to start, and they just bought duplicate copies. So then they'd have things like just the alphabet books and the Trek books or whatever pulled out in front. It wasn't everything, and it was a good place to start. And so getting in that mind of the kid, like all of that reference or like directional service that you provide, if you also have the opportunity to work on a children's desk, is meaningful as a selector, because it tells you how people are actually using the collection and how their questions are framed. So, and I would encourage you to start thinking systematically, or so that it's not just like, oh, I need to teach each of these individuals how to use the catalog. Like they need to learn a skill to like, why is this so hard for people? Like, what could we do as the library to make it a fun, browsable collection that fits how kids' schemas about the world already work? So I think that that's just all connected space and books and shelving.
Well, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and pause or stop the recording.